I am very excited to introduce Ped. Pen is it? How do you pronounce your last name, Ped? I always bumble it.
It's okay. It's Daneshgar.
Daneshgar. There we go. I always hate it when people mispronounce names. So, anyhow, he's a plant ecologist, focused on community and ecosystem ecology. His current research is on coastal forest ecology, looking particularly at the impact of climate change on maritime forest ecosystems in the mid-Atlantic and mangrove systems in the Bahamas. Good excuse to go to the Bahamas. He was working on several New Jersey ecosystems, including cranberry bogs, coastal dunes, salt marshes, and pitch pine forests, etc. He teaches at Monmouth University. He's originally from my own hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, Delaware being even a smaller state than the state of New Jersey. He earned his undergraduate degree in biology from the University of Delaware. He's studied climate impacts on forests in the Pacific Northwest and Gainesville, Florida, and Texas. He's been all over the place. So now he is back here. And once more, do not forget to put your questions for Ped in the Q&A. This time, Bobby Herbs, our NPSNJ corresponding secretary, will be managing the Q&A. And now for our last presentation of the day, Maritime Forests, the most threatened ecosystems of New Jersey. Take it away, Ped.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. Was looking forward to this and I was enjoying the talks and everything. So I'm just going to share a little bit about some of the work I'm doing in New Jersey and one of the ecosystems that I spend time with here in New Jersey. But I'd like to start with a little story. So if you were walking around the city, New York City in 2021, you might have seen this interesting installment in Madison Square Park. And if you were there, you would walk around and what you would see were 49 tall, dead Atlantic white cedars posted in the park. And this was actually the work of an artist named Maya Lin. And the installment was called Ghost Forest. And she put this out there as a statement to inform people about the impacts of climate change. And so a lot of interest as of late has come around as it relates to ghost forest, because we're seeing this phenomena all over the country. Coastal forests being wiped out and leaving these ghosts behind, or symbols of what was once upon a time. And this is a phenomenon that's happening here in New Jersey. Here's an aerial shot where you can see a lot of dead trees. And we see a lot of this in New Jersey, particularly around Barnegat Bay. So why does this happen? Why do all these trees suddenly die? And why do we see this ghost phenomena? Well, there's two sort of explanations to this phenomenon. One's a more gradual one, which is happening right now, and another is a little more rapid. It happens very quickly. In the gradual formation, that's essentially a product of climate change. We are seeing sea level rise, and that rising sea level eventually is going to work its way into the forest systems that are on the coast. Salt water pounding on the coast eventually will kill out trees, and what is replaced in those spaces is salt marsh. So salt marsh is essentially going to be migrating inland and taking the space that was occupied by maritime forests. So you get a system that looks like this: a salt marsh filled with the ghosts of trees of the past. And it is a new style or a new novel ecosystem that wasn't there before. The other way ghost forests emerge is due to large storm events or storm surges, like we saw during Superstorm Sandy, where large flooding events come into a forest. That salt intrusion causes the trees to die. And what you have as a result is an ecosystem that then drains and is filled with empty niches for new things to come in. And what we see happening a lot is kind of invasions by Phragmites in these areas. So you get a reed-dominated ecosystem filled with the ghosts of the trees of the past. So what is lost here when these ghost forests form is essentially maritime forest, because that is where these sea level or storm surges happened to impact these coastal ecosystems. So I just wanted to really quickly define for you what a maritime forest is. There's a lot of debate about this, actually, and there's some differing opinions. But I'd like to separate what is considered maritime versus what is just a coastal forest. You talk to anyone in the central part of our country, they're going to say, well, isn't all forest in New Jersey coastal maritime? And I'd say no. So how we define maritime is any forest system that is subjected to salt. All right. So whether that's by air as salt spray or salt flooding or things like that. And so what you get are a lot of species that have some level of wind and salt tolerance. And they may also be subjected to occasional salt spray pruning, like you see in this picture on the left, where half of the tree looks alive and well and the other half does not. And salt has an impact on it. Now, these ecosystems are essentially products of time. I would argue that a lot of our maritime forests in New Jersey are actually just really, really old dunes. That are products of succession, or like the slow community change over time. There is a little bit of debate about this, but I see a lot of examples of facilitation happening in nature, where you have dune plants establishing, forming dunes, maturing, adding plant biomass and nutrients to the soil, which ultimately facilitates the germination and growth of other plants. So you see a transition from grasses and herbs to more woody species. And then ultimately down the road, you see the formation of maritime forests. These ecosystems then represent a long process, right? And they're essentially mature dunes with a developed soil profile. So this is all part of a dune succession process, which I've kind of highlighted here, which is that pioneer species will colonize a dune, like American beach grass or sea oats or something like that. The roots kind of form the dune, they hold it together, and then when these plants senesce, they contribute to an organic layer, contribute to nutrients being put in the soil, and that organic layer then helps enforce an environment that is suitable for other species to come in. Now, if you were looking into literature, there are essentially 7 different types of maritime forest systems on the Atlantic coast. I have seen 3 or 4 examples of those here in New Jersey, and a lot of it has to do with where the ecosystem sits, how high above sea level the system sits. So in our uplands or areas above sea level, you're going to see things like this: American holly, cedars, some pines, and some sassafras and willow oaks in that area. And what you'll see about a lot of these species that you'll see in these systems is that they're highly adapted to the conditions, right? So they have to be able to handle a little bit of salt. They have to be able to handle wind, because a lot of them are exposed to the wind, and they also have to handle drought conditions, because growing on a dune is essentially like growing in a desert. You got sandy soils, it's dry, the soil gets very hot. And so these plants are adapted. Now, while you'll see some of these species in other parts of New Jersey, the varieties or the ecotypes found in maritime forest are a little more adapted to those conditions. Now, also in some of these maritime areas, you'll have some lowlands where there may be sitting water, and so you'll have swampy type of environments, cedar swampies. You'll see your sweet bays, sweet gums, red maples. You'll see those. So often when you see these species, that's usually an indicator that you're in a lowland or an area that's potentially subjected to flooding or sitting in water for periods of time. I've also observed in New Jersey what I call little sand hills. So they just look like dune mounds, and these are very, very dry and not really full of plant life, but a lot of our Jersey pines will pop up in these places, predominantly pitch pine and loblolly pine in the southern part of the state. If you look under the understory of these ecosystems, you're going to see a lot of fruit-bearing things, flowering plants, lots of shrubs that you would see in other parts of New Jersey as well, from blueberries and inkberries to beach plums, bayberries, swamp azaleas, mountain laurels, and things like that. And so if you look at this right away, you can see the services that these plants might provide to other members of the ecosystem or of the community. So lots of fruits, which should draw wildlife, deer, and a lot of flowers for pollinators in these environments. These maritime forests tend to be viney as well, and so here are 3 of our natives that you'll see pop up from time to time. All 3 of these you will see on dunes as well. And in fact, in some parts of New Jersey, they manage for poison ivy. It's a strategy for keeping people off the dunes. By letting them be overgrown with poison ivy, people are less likely to trample on the dunes when poison ivy is there. And greenbrier, if you've ever gone hiking and encountered it, is sweet pain to the leg if you're walking through that as well. Maritime forests have a lot of cool wildlife in them. Some mammals, red foxes, cottontails, a lot of songbirds, scarlet tanagers, warblers, tree swallows, and some birds of prey as well, hawks, kestrels. And in the winter, these forests may be stopping grounds for things like snowy owl and all that. So that's a nice find if you're a Harry Potter fan or something and you'd like to catch these in the wild in New Jersey. These ecosystems are really important for a lot of different reasons, not only just for holding wildlife, but they are also really important for groundwater filtration. So rain that comes down on these areas where these forests exist, they filter that water, which ultimately fills a space called the freshwater lens. So a lot of our barrier islands have this aquatic body underneath of it. And often we see developers may well that. They might tap into that groundwater and take advantage of that. Now, saltwater may intrude at high events from the coast and may ultimately impact that water lens, but there is a nice mixing zone that separates those two. And so there is some good fresh water, and which is really important for the trees, particularly the deep rooting dicots that are trying to access that water down below. Other services these forests provide, storm protection. We hear that about all our little plant communities on the coast, but they do provide significant storm protection, blocking wind, blocking surges and all that. They do store nutrients, and they also are really good carbon sinks. Here's a student of mine, Jen Ermston, who actually studied this by looking at tree cores, tree rings, in species growing in these forests. And we actually saw a trend of increasing growth, increasing productivity and carbon storage in these environments, partially due to the rising amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, the sad part of the story is in New Jersey, we don't have a lot of maritime forests left. This is why I argue that it's the most threatened ecosystem in the state. Once upon a time, we had forests all along the coast, all along our barrier islands, but now a lot of that is restricted to parks and natural areas or wildlife areas. So we have forests up in Sandy Hook at the Gateway Recreational Area. That actually houses the oldest American hollies in the country. We got small little community parks like Crescent Park and Seagirt, and then some larger parks like Island Beach State Park. You may see some forests at the at Cape May by the lighthouse. And because of all this development and all that, only 1% of our maritime forests remain compared to the original range of them back in the past. So why have all these forests disappeared? One is obvious, is that we've developed the lands where they should be. So on the left here, we have an aerial shot of Island Beach State Park. You can see the oceans on the left and the bays on the right. And you can see here a demonstration on how this ecosystem can act like a wall of protection, right? So if storm surges are happening, hurricanes, things like that are coming off the coast, they're going to first encounter those walls of trees before they head inland. If we take that away, we lose that service. And we've developed these lands because everybody would love to have a beach house and love to live there. And so you see here on the right what has actually happened to most of our coastal lands. The other threat to our forests are climate change. And so with climate change, there's a couple things that happen, right? Rising CO2 is kind of one of what's the kind of causing climate change. One of the factors anyway. And we have, like I mentioned before, that leads to increased productivity and growth of our forests. But the increasing storms that are associated with climate change, sea level rise, have impacts. So these floods, increased salt exposure may lead to, or should lead to, more tree mortality, habitat loss, and like I mentioned before, salt marsh transgression into these ecosystems. So not a great scenario. And so you get the formation of those ghost forests that I mentioned at the beginning. And so one of the things that I've been looking at in my lab with my students is how these ghost forests function differently than the healthy forests that they replace. So we've been setting up studies looking at changes in plant communities, changes in wildlife. Here on the left, you see pictures of recording devices that we use to track animal sounds and animal movements. And we did some studies at Sandy Hook and also at Caddis Island County Park, which is along Barnegat Bay and Toms River. And we were kind of comparing how the communities change. So down there on the bottom, you see what a healthy forest might look like with a trail. And then on the right, you see a ghost forest. And so what you see first are some major plant community changes. So you go from a system that has a nice canopy that creates differential light on the forest floor, and you're going to get bayberries and blueberries and some smaller trees, sassafras and dogwoods growing underneath, to a system that has no canopy and is dominated either by reeds like Phragmites or some salt marsh tolerant grass species, spartinas like alterniflora and patens, that kind of fill that space. What you do see in common is kind of the vines kind of persist in both ecosystems. And so if you go from what you see on the left to what you see on the right, you see a lot of fruit-bearing things to some things that aren't as friendly for animals. And so we see a shift from wildlife like songbirds that like to perch in those, to mammals that like to feed on those, to more birds of prey and less songbirds on the right. And so there is sort of a shift that happens, but also an opportunity for some species that don't kind of persist in these healthy forests, but might take advantage of the ghost forest. So one thing that kind of pops up, you have these large trees, and they end up ultimately being great nesting grounds for things like osprey. So that is one thing that one sort of benefit that is we have observed from these ghost forests. But how do you weigh that against what is lost? That's a good question. So if we're seeing increased salt impacts, salt flooding, things like that, one might wonder, are there trees that can actually survive this? So which tree species are most threatened by sea level rise and increased flooding? So we did a little experiment where we took a bunch of species that are commonly found in maritime forests, and here are some pictures of my students, and we actually took a bunch of juveniles and set up a design in our greenhouse, and we salt flooded them. Now, what we did is we manipulated the amount of salt, so the salinity of salt that they were exposed to, and then we also looked at the impacts of flood frequency. So what if we kept the salinity the same, but we varied how often these trees were flooded? And so what we did was we recreated what the current flood rate is right now, and well, when we did the experiment in 2019, and compared that to what it's projected to be like in 2030 and 2045, which is much more frequent. So here's a little picture showing you what salt flooding looks like initially. So we have a southern oak on the left and a red maple on the right, and you can see it's kind of tragic, but also beautiful to kind of see those salt impacts on the foliage. Different plants have different strategies of dealing with salt. Some of them will actually kind of move salt to the leaves, then shed those leaves, and then form new leaves right after. Others, the whole thing just sort of kind of dies out. So this may make you wonder, well, what does salt actually do to the plants, right? Well, salt in the soil might impede the ability for the roots to take up water. Water is like an interesting thing because water likes to create balance, create sort of similarities in concentrations and environments on both sides of the barrier. So water will want to kind of create equal salinities on both sides of inside and outside the root or inside and outside of plant cells. So it may move out. And so ultimately salt has a dehydration effect on plants. Salt can also cause bud scales to desiccate. This is problematic because those structures are protective. And so exposing those very sensitive tissues is why we see things like burn and stuff like that in plants. Salt may also displace nutrients. So a lot of how plants take up nutrients is having nutrients dissolved in solution or in water. And if salt is in there, it might cause some of the essential nutrients that plants need to leach away. And then salt we see leads to discoloration and pigment breakdown in plants. So impacting their plant ability to photosynthesize, for example, to feed themselves. So here's just a little demonstration of changing salinity and how that impacts tree survival for our experiment. And this is over the course of a single growing season. So when the salinity had reached about 15 parts per thousand, that killed off about half our trees. So just so we all understand, 15 parts per thousand is half the salt level of what we see in the ocean, a little less than half actually. So this is what flooding from Barnegat Bay may look like, right? When sea level rise happens and then you have high tide events, particularly during full moons and things like that, storm surges, that's the kind of salt that you would get in the forest on the backside of barrier islands. And so at a 50% rate, we're going to see high mortality. Where you see 5, that salinity of 5, you can see most trees can handle that level of salt. So there's, it may depend on where you are on the coast, where those trees are in relation to the bay or along estuaries. If they're in areas that is still predominantly fresh, then the flooding impacts may not be as detrimental. Here's a little table just kind of showing you mortality of the species that we tested on. And so the higher the number, the more death we saw. And so you can see 3 species in our experiment did really well. Our red cedars, our sweet gums, and our willow oaks seem to be able to handle that salt flooding on a fixed schedule. Now, when we varied how frequently the salt impacted them, that gave us a little bit different result. Here we see our little species and how their biomass or their growth was impacted with increasing salinity. So here we see a drop in a lot of cases. And when you see this little asterisk, that means it was significant. So we have black cherries and our pitch pines and our black gums that decline in growth was significant when exposed to salt. Here is our mortality as it relates to what's projected to happen. So you can see at current flood rates, not a lot of mortality. What's projected to happen in 2013, we see an increase in mortality. By 2045. That increase in mortality is very high. So just to give you some framework on what flooding would look like. So on average, flooding events may happen on a monthly basis. So one big high tide a month right now. By 2030, that's projected to be on a weekly basis. And by 2045, you would have a high tide flooding events impacting forests multiple times a week, 2 to 3 times a week. So kind of a little scary implications there. So what we found from this work is that, red sweeters, sweet gums, and willow oaks surprisingly did really well when exposed to salt. So that might suggest what we want to do in terms of plantings around coastal areas. But it also implies that there's the work that implies that there's going to be a diversity decline in these systems. So we're going to see the number of species go down, and then that has huge implications for the things that feed on these systems. Here's our sad little squirrel. Because there may be less food options in the future. And for the birders out there that like to go to these forests to see wildlife, we might see less and less diversity of wildlife in these systems over time. So what do we do about it? So we may want to think about solutions or maybe interested in plantings. If you live near the coast, if you live in areas where you're going to likely have the impacts of salt. I live about a mile from the ocean, and on some mornings I can smell salt in the air. So you don't want to plant salt tolerance, right? If imitate what nature is doing really well. Walk around these forests and see what's persisting. And so hollies and cedars, beach plums, bayberries, those are all things that should do well when you're planting them on your property. There are also these 2 tree species that I have here are evergreen, right? They remain green year round, and that's nice. And beach plum, if you've never eaten them, that's a nice little perk to have on your property is, a harvestable fruit that you can feed on. Now, after these areas, if you live in an area or there's parks or lands that have been flooded, is restoration worthwhile? Should we be trying to fix those or change them back, right? So it just really depends on what your objectives are. Are you trying to recreate the system that was replaced? Or are you trying to bring trees back? Or are we trying to perhaps prevent the invasion of something like Phragmites and try new things? So you have to think about these when you're talking about restoration. One thing to think about is well, how salty is the soil? How long will it remain salty? You might have to monitor that over time. It may depend on how many rain events you have that can kind of dilute that soil or wash some of that soil away. Will those salts in the soils actually decline? And do we accept that maybe that these, once they've been salt impacted, that these systems are ultimately permanently that way? And so we might have to accept or embrace new ecosystems or modified ecosystems from what we lost. We've been experimenting with this. We've been taking soils that are salt flooded, that we simulate what happens or what has happened in storms. For example, we took a bunch of pots of soil and we flooded them for approximately half a day, 12 hours or so, to kind of simulate what happened in Sandy. And then we tried plantings of various things to see, well, what would work? What could handle that salty soil right away? And then we also varied planting time after simulating rainfall. And so we saw things like this, where things like marsh elder from before and after, depending on when we planted, seemed to do well. So that might be a strategy to be thinking about. If you live in spaces where there is flooding, you might want to consider things like marsh elder, which provide a lot of services and might be your preference over reed or something like that. Now, in regards to maritime forests, a lot of communities, coastal communities, are understanding the loss and are trying to do their best to preserve it. There was a little bit of a conservation battle that happened in some towns over development of those forests, where the communities are standing up and protesting the building of those. And then there's also communities that try to start rebuilding maritime forests of their own. One happened at Bradley Beach. They designated an area, they brought in some coastal engineers, and they did some plantings. I've been to these sites, and initially planted a bunch of trees, but not all of them persisted. So what we have is sort of a modified coastal area that has some trees in it. And so this presents itself as a challenge. We can't just like plant trees that we see in a maritime forest and voila, have a maritime forest. Partly because, as I mentioned before, these forests are products of succession and time. So it's not something you can recreate. And they also rely on having protection from the dune systems that are next to them. So getting a system like this, like a holly forest like we see up at Sandy Hook, is a little bit tricky, and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of considerations in terms of types of soils and all that. So we got to be a little bit strategic when we're trying to recreate these. My best advice right now is to do everything we can to preserve what remains and discourage more development of our coast, so that over time some small forest systems and little patches may develop. I moved pretty quickly. I'm sorry about that. I just want to acknowledge some students and some colleagues that helped me with some of the work that I presented today. And if you have any questions, I'll take those now. And if you're interested in following me, I have a couple of YouTube channels. One of them is called Nerdy Naturalists. We talk about, we do a little fact checking of pop culture. And I'm also on Instagram if you want to see updates on some of the work that I'm doing.
Hi, Ped. Thank you. That
Yeah.
was awesome. That was awesome. I have a few questions. We're curious about what happens as the salt water infiltrates and goes inland, but does that pocket of fresh water stay under the dune, if you will? And is that still supporting the plant life there?
Yeah. So that it's interesting, that little pocket of freshwater, that lens I mentioned, it can persist. It's fairly resilient. It's just the flooding adds more and more pressure and more mixing where those salt and fresh interact. And so we may see a little bit of a constriction of that lens. And that actually is something to kind of keep an eye on. So folks that build wells on these barrier islands are essentially pulling from that lens and ultimately decreasing how much water is there, and are essentially facilitating more saltwater intrusion inland. And so if plants are tapping that area for water and all of a sudden there's salt, they're going to pull it up and experience salt damage.
So if I'm doing landscaping on the barrier island, I should be looking at these salt tolerant plants more than other plants.
Right. Yeah. So if you're looking, particularly if you're looking for perennial woody species, because you're trying to draw birds to your property, you want to go with some of these salt tolerant plants for sure.
Okay.
People plant whatever they want, it seems, but
that's probably the truth. Are there any rare plants or rare animals that we should be thinking about protecting as these ghost marshes persist?
That's a good question. I'd have to get back to you on that. I'd have to think about that. When you walk through these forests, you tend to see a lot of the same things off trail, like along the trails. But some of these forests are pretty hard to navigate because of all the briny, the briary types of things growing in them. They're very hard to kind of walk through. So I'm sure there's going to be some species hiding out. But I'll have to think about that.
How about Baccharis homifolium?
What's that?
The plant Baccharis, is that something that you studied or know could survive in these environments?
It may be able to handle it. Yeah, I haven't observed it in the field, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it out there.
Cool. And then some of the few nerdy naturalist YouTube channels are out there. Could you please say again what your link is so everybody can hear it? And when the recording's done and published,
Sure.
they can hear it again.
Sure. So if you're interested just in plant talks, I have a YouTube channel called Geeky Gardener. You can just search Geeky Gardener in YouTube. And I have videos about some of the ecosystems of New Jersey and things like that. If you're interested in the fun fact checking of pop culture and for biological accuracy, you can search Nerdy Naturalists on YouTube. We take looks at comic book movies and Star Wars and Disney films and things like that. So we just started that. A friend and I just started that, and so we just launched that. So share it with the kids. Actually, the kids get a kick out of it. So
Okay.
we found a lot wrong with Finding Nemo, and that seems to be our most popular video. So
So there's no solutions to this. We can't build seawalls. We can't protect these freshwater systems. Is there any technology that could help support?
yeah, so
preservation?
so that's a good question. So there are seawalls may work in impeding some flooding events. Always building our dunes and making sure that they persist, provide some protection. We're seeing a lot of work being done, particularly in the Bay, to create essentially barriers to floods and wave action. So that kind of thing can happen. Also expanding some of our marsh areas to absorb some of the impact of flooding, all those kinds of things. I know the Nature Conservancy is working on things like that. So all these things can ultimately impact and prolong or delay the inevitable, I think. But what we also will see in these areas is that the upland areas that I mentioned are the ones that'll persist, and some of the lowland areas are the ones that are going to be replaced. And so the forest systems will become a little patchier over time.
And saltwater, two questions I'm going to try to blend into one.
Sure.
Is the saltwater intrusion irreversible? And is it moving inland? Are we impacting aquifers and freshwater inland over time?
So the saltwater is moving inland, but we're also seeing sort of a migration of our islands inland as well. So everything is kind of moving. So salt marsh is moving, the islands are moving and all that. So that is happening. Saltwater is working its way in. The impacts of salt in terms of whether it's reversible, it just depends on the amount of exposure, the frequency of exposure. So you could have like a single event, a single storm surge or something like that, and a lot of times you see recovery. It's when the water persists for a long period of time or it happens frequently that we see the impacts there. So,
and this question comes up in a lot of our presentations. We are the New Jersey Native Plant Society, but we need because of climate change, to be evaluating plants from the South. Are there any southerly plants, coastal plants that we might be thinking about if we want to garden for wildlife on the barrier reefs or on the bay shores?
yeah, so that's a good question. So my collaborator who works in Delaware is seeing there's a lot of species in common. we're going to see a little shift in some of the pine species, a little shift in some of the oak species. Southern red oak and blah, blah, they're going to migrate northward. So those will work. But a lot of what we are seeing in our forests persist all up and down the coast, all the way down to Florida. So, so I think a lot of it's not going to be a lot of bit different, or it won't be a lot different, I would say. Some of our dune species change, but there's a lot in common. And as I mentioned, there's ecotypes. So there are region specific. So you're just going to see southern ecotypes or varieties migrate northward, but to the ordinary like viewer, they might not notice that difference. It's just their tolerance and or their acclimation to the environment might be a little bit different, but
okay, cool. Well, I'm going to hand it back to Randy, and I want to thank you so very much. It was a pleasure to meet you back in the summer, and even greater pleasure to be able to host your Q&A session. So thank you so
sure,
much.
it was fun. Thank you.
Take care.